Hello, everybody. Welcome to the ACHA seminar. My name is Jack Downey. I teach at the University of Rochester in New York, not in Minnesota. And I am going to be the MC for today's event, where we're going to be workshopping this wonderful piece of work from Elayne Oliphant. And there's a couple of logistical things I just want to go through in addition to the technical difficulties that we've been working through. So one is just how this is going to work. This is it's only our second seminar. So we kind of modeled this off of the Newberry seminars and actually at the suggestion of the Newberry. And the whole idea behind this was to give us an opportunity to get a kind of preview of the scholarship that some of the leading folks in our field are working on, but also to get a sense of actually the nuts and bolts of the process of developing a work, and to get a kind of a rear view into the actual process of workshopping ideas, and hopefully, most importantly, to generate some help for Elayne in terms of kind of how she's thinking about her project, largely by having these interlocutors who are also leading scholars in the field. The goal for us is to do this twice a year. So there's going to be one in the fall, and stay tuned for information coming from that. The last person that we had was Mike Pasquier, who's in the audience right now. And the format for this is fairly simple. So Elayne's draft has been circulated, and hopefully everyone in the audience has had the opportunity to give it a look. If not, you still have it, so you can keep it in perpetuity. Elayne is going, once I'm done with my spiel, Elayne is going to have some time to give an overview of the project, to review some of the material that she's written, but also hopefully give some context for how this project came to be and how she sees it moving forward. Then our interlocutors, who are, I'll give the introductions in a second, but our interlocutors will have some time to one by one respond to Elayne's draft. Then that will lead to conversation between the four, and then we'll open it up to questions from the general audience. Those questions will be funneled through me just for the sake of expediency. And so I would encourage you to use either a direct chat message to me if you can, or the Q&A function on the Zoom, which audience members should have access to. And just so you know, we do have a hard stop by 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. If we have a natural end beforehand, that's totally fine, but I want to be respectful of people's time commitments. So if we get to 1:30 and things are still rolling, I will throw in the proverbial towel and we'll call it a day. This is going to be recorded, so it is currently being recorded. So if you miss something, or you have to step out for a minute, or you can't stay around for the whole time, that's no worries. You will have opportunities to watch this in the future down the road. Sorry, I've got a cat situation I'm dealing with. Okay, for introductions. So Elayne Oliphant is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Religious Studies at New York University. She's the author of The Privilege of Being Banal: Art, Secularism, and Catholicism in Paris, which won the Clifford Geertz Prize from the Society of the Anthropology of Religion in 2022. Her research focuses on the effects of Christian privilege in secular Europe and the complex place of Roman Catholicism in Europe's enduring history of colonial exploitation. She's currently researching a new book that looks at Catholic land use practices in France, including its territories in the Caribbean. Now for the interlocutors, and this is going to be the order in which they will be responding. So first up is Brenna Moore. Brenna is Professor of Theology at Fordham University in New York. She's author of Kindred Spirits: Friendship and Resistance at the Edges of Modern Catholicism, and most recently, Mutuality in El Barrio: Stories of the Little Sisters of the Assumption Family Health Services, which is coming out next week, or no, in a couple of weeks. Also, Brenna is, as most of you know, past president of the American Catholic Historical Association, venerable post. And then up we have Jennifer Scheper Hughes, who is Professor of History at the University of California, Riverside. Her research focuses on Latin America and Latinx religions, with special consideration for the spiritual lives of Mexican Catholics. Her first book, Biography of a Mexican Crucifix, Lived Religion and Local Faith from the Conquest to the Present, which came out in 2010, explores the affective bonds that join devotional communities to vital and agentic objects of material religion. Her second book, The Church of the Dead, The Epidemic of 1576 and the Birth of Christianity in the Americas, which came out in 2021, explores the origins of Mexican Catholicism in the colonial context, or in the context of colonial cataclysm. And then batting cleanup is Katharine Gerbner, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Minnesota, where she also serves as Director of the Religious Studies program. Her research examines the history of race and religion in the early modern world, and her first book, Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World, which came out in 2018, showed how religion was fundamental to the development of slavery and race. Her current research project, entitled Caribbean Reformations, examines the Afro-Caribbean practices of Obeah and its relationship to Protestant Christianity in the 18th century. I should also note before we get started, with some gratitude for logistical help, that the rest of the committee for the ACHA seminar is Kathleen Holscher at University of New Mexico and Paula Kane from Pitt. So grateful for their work on this. And for Alice and Isidore in particular, also Andy Metzger at ACHA and Charles Strauss, of course, our leader, our shepherd in all things ACHA. So without further ado, Elayne, would you like the floor for the next few minutes? And this is, sure. I mean, for the audience, this is relatively informal. So, you know, we have the only like rule here really is a 1:30 end time. Everything else is going to be fairly flowy, but you're welcome to send me questions throughout this entire thing, and I'm just going to keep them until our main four speakers are done. Okay, thanks, Elayne, please.
Thank you. First of all, I just really want to thank Jack and the members of the ACHA seminar committee for this really kind invitation to present new work, which is a huge honor to get early feedback on things that are still very much in formation. Second, I'd really like to thank Katharine, Brenna, and Jen for so generously agreeing to serve as discussants in the middle of the semester. I know it's an additional labor, not a small amount of additional labor on your part, and I'm such huge admirers of your work, and I was really humbled when you all agreed to do this. And I'd also like to thank everybody who's here today for reading and for your patience in a bit of a large piece going in many directions, and I'm really interested to hear your feedback. I've got kind of some formal comments prepared, but I don't want to take up too much time. So part of what I wanted to say was to kind of explain my approach as an anthropologist who's engaging with historical arguments, but I don't want to take up too much time in doing so. For those of you who are more or less familiar with anthropology as a discipline, I understand it as a discipline that requires the ethnographic research, which allows us to pay attention over a long period of time, and that allows us to identify things that are taken for granted, things that stand out, things that are typical, things that are unusual. And each of these different vantage points can allow us to offer a different way of interpreting social life, tensions and social processes. So whether I'm looking at archives or using ethnographic methods, I feel at liberty, more than most disciplines perhaps, to just turn to moments that are both banal and exceptional to try to interpret social life through them. Second, anthropologists try to distinguish between their objects of study and their subjects of study. So, for example, in my first book, my primary subject of study was a Catholic cultural center in Paris, but my object of study was the privilege of Catholicism in secular France. So in this project, which is still quite early in its formation, I admittedly am captivated by a few too many subjects of study: spaces in Paris through which the French nation is imagined, efforts by activists and artists in Paris and Martinique, to explode and expand that which is imagined as France and as French. And somewhat new for me, archival sources that take me to debates about freedom, Christianity, and labor between the Second Abolition in France in 1848 and the end of the 19th century. But my object of study in all of these sites remains the kind of eschatological event of 1492, and its seemingly endless wake, and how this event has shaped Europe, France, and its various expressions of Roman Catholicism. I'm interested in the variety of tools that Euro-Christians make use of to maintain a social imaginary of their supremacy. And while I did not articulate this in the paper, I fully acknowledge that Catholicism is a fascinating subject of study from a variety of different disciplines, precisely because its images, actors, narratives, and rituals have contributed both to the reproduction of this imaginary of Euro-Christian supremacy and its undoing. And so people here, like Jennifer Scheper Hughes, have offered really beautiful studies of these practices of undoing. But I can't seem to stop focusing on privilege and power, even when I really actually try to. And so those remain my primary objects. That remains my primary object of study here, both historically and in the present, which means I'm not looking at those projects, those Catholic projects that try to unravel Euro-Christian claims to supremacy. And finally, my primary concern as a sociocultural anthropologist is with the present. And the many historians in this group of historians likely cringed at moments as I leapt from 1492 to the 1874 and 1898 and the present. So thank you for bearing with me. I just want to point to the kind of the paintings of Catholic saints that I describe in the Panthéon, demonstrate how the humans I'm interested in don't stick to strict chronology either, and so it's their fault. And I'm really wanting to think about how, as Vincent Brown put it recently, how to make the past accountable to the needs of the present, which is something that he kind of reflected on as a historian. He doesn't feel the authority to do that work per se. But I think that is part of what anthropologists are trying to do, to both make the past accountable to the needs of the present and to make the present accountable to the obligations imposed upon us by our violent histories. And at times that requires me to make historical arguments, and that's certainly a task with which I'm still grappling. I don't want to take up very much time here. This work could be a standalone piece. It could be a chapter in the broader study. This piece could go so many ways. I debated for a long time about how to describe the different figures that the artist can brought into the Panthéon, and to footnote them was kind of a stylistic, but also kind of ethical choice, and then doing the same with the figures that I describe as being depicted on the walls of the Panthéon. But each of those figures can open up onto such an enormous terrain. So there's just so many ways to push out and beyond that particular moment in which they all came to converge together. And so I'm really interested to hear from you, what parts you find compelling and how you would like, if this piece were to stand alone, how you might like to see it open up. But I do see it as connected to this new book project that I'm taking on, where I'm looking largely at land use practices, recognizing that one of the key things that the Catholic Church did in the French Caribbean was to help discourage the use of gardens and land ownership by the formerly enslaved. so that they would be forced to continue to participate in plantation labor. And that choice has had long-lasting repercussions, including the kind of extraordinarily ill health of the landscapes of Martinique, and of Martinican people whose bodies have been poisoned by different insecticides that have been used in plantations that continue to exist in Martinique. So the use of Creole gardens as a way of kind of reasserting these practices that were attempted, that had been, forced into, that were not allowed to be practiced for so long, as well as looking at similar kinds of protests and alternative land practices in continental France, particularly a village in Ardèche that is protesting the expansion of Christian domination of the village by the creation of an enormous basilica to welcome pilgrims. So these kind of actions of protest for me are another way at getting at the question of Euro-Christian supremacy. These protests speak to the supremacy. The Raphael Barantini's exhibit, it was so shocking, because the fact that it was so shocking spoke to the very kind of limited notions of humanity that had been allowed to exist in that space of the Panthéon, and the very limited notions of God and of religion that had been allowed to be celebrated in that space. So this kind of work of understanding how Christianity participates in the claims to supremacy, largely through this incredibly vast material wealth of stuff that populates the museums, churches, landscapes of urban and rural France. But to continue to focus on those practices risks kind of redoing that overrepresentation. So I'm trying to come at that overrepresentation from the practices that protest it, that point to it, and that call for something different. So I do see Barantini's Carnival as connected to these land use, alternative land use practices, for the ways that he brings something back into view that does kind of work of reparation. And just the one last thing I want to say is that I focus on these Christian practices that emphasize Euro-Christian supremacy because I think that in Europe, like any other religious group, Christians and Catholics Christians, including Catholics, are thinking about how to kind of position themselves in an ever-changing social and political landscape. But in addition to doing that, they are also thinking about how to maintain that privilege and that domination of the public sphere that they inhabit. And that is an unspoken priority. And I think that if it were not the same level of unspoken priority, then Roman Catholicism in Europe and Europe could look really different. And I do think that part of the work of reparation will be asking Christianity to take up less space in the public sphere, making more room for other gods in the Pantheon. And so that's the kind of ethical project that I'm interested in pursuing. And through these kind of two tracks, looking at this work of overrepresentation through these material and discursive practices, and the efforts to undo that work and offer alternative ways of being in the present. So I guess the kind of privilege of tenure is being able to think, far too eclectically and without the necessity of focusing in quickly and decisively. So I'm really grateful to you all for thinking with me at this early stage of stumbling through questions that are really important to me, but that could take on a variety of forms. So I'll stop there. Oh, I did want to show a quick video of the exhibition. Could you click on the first video link by chance? One sec.
Just 1 second.
This is, or hopefully will be, how I described standing before Fatima and feeling the sense of her breathing in the space of the Pantheon. And they'll give you a sense of the sound, and as it kind of shifts away, you'll see the kind of crowd and the context of the celebration. If it can't be done now, we can come back to it later.
I think I can make it work. Just one of the hazards of like, I want to share the screen that I want to share, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I know, not your grocery list.
Hang on.
The dance that accompanies it, but that's okay. I just wanted to give a little sense of the Carnival. The other video of Fatima is a bit longer, but that was two members of Mas Choukaj dancing before the banners of the figures, as they were kind of carried to the end of the nave before the doors opening. But you could hear the conch shell and see the kind of dancers, and if you've ever been inside the Panthéon, you would recognize that that's an atypical practice for that space.
Elayne, if you would like, we could just do the other one as well.
Sure, yeah, it's just 1 minute long, and
all right.
It's pretty moving. You don't necessarily need the sound. It's similar music that happens behind it, but you can see the kind of Thank you.
So now, Brenna, if you would like to take it away with the responses and get this party started.
Okay. Thank you so much, Elayne, for sharing your paper with us, and also for your remarks. Just I have a few brief comments prepared, but I just wanted to also just comment on your introduction and your framing. I so appreciated, I love the videos, and I also so appreciated you introducing your work by telling us a little bit more about the norms and your understanding of your own discipline of anthropology, and just looking around at the screen, we have people in religious studies, history, theology, anthropology, just on our small conversation. And I think that's one of the great things about the ACHA, but also I think it's so important to about the ways that each of our subdisciplines or fields kind of reconfigures kind of how we think about the relationship between the past and the present, where we situate the ethical or creative or constructive work that kind of energizes or animates our projects in Catholicism. So I just really appreciated that framing. And so just to turn to my briefly prepared remarks, I just wanted to say I really loved reading about your new project. It was such a bright spot this week and a really kind of hectic week after spring break. And it was such a pleasure to immerse myself in your writing, especially having read really closely your last work on the privilege of being banal. That I always see your work as something that has a deep moral center of gravity. I think Elayne's work here and her earlier work is always so attentive to how inequality and power get very subtly and quietly reproduced, and not just as a kind of gotcha project, but for the purpose of naming it and uncovering it so that we have a much truthful and fuller sense of reality and can more honestly go forward as we imagine new possibilities. So I see that as kind of a red thread throughout your work, and it was wonderful to see this here. A couple just gems I wanted to highlight, and then I have a couple brief questions. But the gems, I just thought your writing about the kind of artistic takeover of the Panthéon was just beautiful. This sense of the artistic reimagination of the possibilities that were opened up in this new artistic takeover of the Panthéon, and also some of your even funny lines in there about what wasn't possible, and the ways that the imagination was broke open and also limited. It was just really, really beautiful. And I appreciated you taking us on your intellectual and imaginative journey, really richly describing your experience, but also taking us through your questions and your what ifs. What if this would have been possible? What if this would have been earlier? What could have happened? I just really loved that. The other gem I wanted to point out was I found it absolutely stunning and chilling, the Victor Hugo lines, that his speeches that were his speech in 1879 that was calling for the end of slavery in France, that could have been, these early reckonings, this truth-telling, this real reckoning with the violent history of Euro-Christian slavery, became a moment to once again, as you put it, kind of double down on Euro-Christian supremacy. And what could have been a reckoning was reconfigured as yet another gift of white Christianity to the subaltern or to other modes of life in the world. Those were just like incredible examples, and the way that you framed it was beautiful. So I wouldn't touch any of those. And to turn to my questions, it's nothing that I would necessarily revise, but I would love to hear you just say a little bit more. And here they are. Okay. So one is a question that I would love to hear you, if you have time, to say a little bit more about how you see this project furthering or doing something bolder than what you did in your first book on the privilege of being banal. And I noticed on page 14, you said, and I'm quoting your work on 14, it says, "I want to push beyond an argument which I have too often found myself mired, namely one that would be concerned with explaining the Catholicity of this space, whose symbolism is primarily understood in secular Republican terms. I want to argue that the two, the Catholic and the secular, are expressed in similarly absolutist terms in France, and thus can equally contribute to the far more significant project of articulating Euro-Christian and specifically French moral and cultural Euro-Christian supremacy." And I just wondered if you might say a little bit more about that argument you find yourself mired in and how you want to push further. And is that a pushing further on how your first book saw power as something banal and privileged, and in the background that Catholicism can kind of inhabit France as just this, what you use the word as unmarked, it's like unmarked, unremarkable background of cultural French culture that is a way of exerting tremendous power and as exerting tremendous power. And here, like, I'm just wondering, can banal forms of power and very much more kind of strident authoritarian forms of power simultaneously take place? I just wanted to hear you say a little bit more about this new project in relation to the old, and maybe that point where you were reflecting on your own, where you get stuck, maybe that would be a place to think about this. And the other piece, I'll be really brief. I'm not going to read what I had because I had something longer, and you had mentioned this a bit in your introduction to Elayne. But I wonder if you might help us share a little bit more about your use of some of these really big kind of sweeping civilizational categories to think about the theoretical concepts you're using, like such as some of the, thinking of 1492 as an eschatological event. And you talk a lot about these kind of binary struggle or the cosmic ongoing battle between Christian hegemonic notions and sort of other forms of other life worlds, the subaltern life world. And I just want to hear you reflect a little bit, and I know you have a lot of interesting things to say. Is this a kind of these more kind of sweeping, bigger, more binary ways of thinking about power and Christianity? Are you kind of pushing back on the way the field has so emphasized hybridity and, indigenous notions of Catholic resistance or Catholic reclamations of power in subaltern communities? I'm thinking of, and you had mentioned Jennifer's work, but I'm thinking of even this year's ACHA Book Prize winner, Afro-Atlantic Catholics. And so I just wonder, how you kind of hold together these like larger binary conceptual frameworks versus, I think, so much work that's happening on the ground in terms of Catholicism and Christian hegemony and colonialism. And so those are my two questions, but overall I just wanted to say thank you for making my week and reminding me of the fun that we can have in our field by reading each other's work. So thank you, Elayne, and I'll turn it now over to Katharine.
I think Jennifer, you want to go next? I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I'm fine. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be included in the conversation, and I have free-ranging thoughts without without too much structure. And I also felt the sort of power of the your descriptive power and kind of drawing the reader into this extraordinary and exceptional moment. And that you make it look easy. I know it's not easy, right? Like that we're in this space and in this sort of transformative moment. I was especially drawn to the obviously the materiality of this event and the disruptive power of these textiles, right? The sort of textile art. And you showed us that video of the way that a textile can take breath, right? And I noted in that video too, the kind of the sound of the music almost becomes like biological processes in terms of pulsating blood and heartbeat, right? So she really is animated in that ritual and in that rite. So I was taken with the kind of historical, symbolic, and religious power of the filminess and the sort of silkiness of these animate textiles against this stone monument, sort of seemingly impenetrable stone monument. But then I also wanted to think about the monumentality of the textiles. I don't know. And also the breath of the stone too, right? And thinking about the way that stone itself can breathe and this building itself breathes in some way, right? So I kind of was drawn by that. And I thought about Carolyn Dean. Carolyn Dean has this incredible book on stone and rock in the Andes. It's like a 500 brilliant book on stone, right? And so I started to think about the way that stone also has life and the way that monument, its meanings and significance aren't fixed in stone in a sense, right? Because it's been a place of contest from your description and throughout its existence, really, of contested meaning, right? So does stone breathe too? I don't know. And then the monumental power of the textile artworks, I also, for me, just have been thinking more specifically, I think about, is it possible to do, I guess I want to say, I don't think it's any more possible to do Catholic studies without a consideration of fundamental consideration of difficulty, right? So Catholic studies is fundamentally about difficulty, difficult history. And I think that is the Catholic experience worldwide as well. So the scholars kind of catching up with that, right? To be Catholic is a difficult, is mired in difficulty. And I think Brenna, you got at that too, because I was also thinking, well, these Haitian saints are also Catholic, right? And so, and these rites are also imbued with Catholic meaning, even in their sort of, as a product of the Black Atlantic world, right? But anyway, legacies of Catholic violence, difficulty is inherent to the study of Catholicism today. What else? I wanted to say, yeah, also like Brenna, this sort of the idea of the eschatological, a kind of cosmic eschatological Catholic battle, and the sort of centering of 1492. And I guess I feel our field, we need to, it's big enough, right, to be able to think about the sort of unraveling, the undoing, the hybridities, and also the inherent, the sort of battle lines, right, that are drawn, right, and the those are both true, right? They're both true. I did, as I was reading this, and I think about 1492, and also as this, I don't know, a monumental kind of date here, but the sort of fixing of 1492 as a religious point of origin, I just wonder about the sort of mythologization, right, of 1492 and the problems with that also, right? So not to say don't do it at all, because I think it's essential to kind of return again and again to this and to reframe it. I had a question about the relationship between the eschatological and the ontological, right, with that date, because I've been reading about sort of the rereading again about the ontological impacts, right, of 1492 and the aftermath. But then I also thought, well, is France's ruination of Haiti its own eschatological event, right? Or is it just subsequent iteration of the wake of 1492, right? Is sort of is an eschatological event always singular, right? Or are these sort of, different kind of collapsing eschatological points of origin, sort of thinking about where we begin. And also so interesting and obvious to see Haiti so central here, right? And these deities and divinities and and then the grappling with the history and its place in the present, just so important here. And I think also within Black studies in the United States, the kind of imagining otherwise, right? Otherwise histories. And so that word and that framing came to me as I was reading this. So that's kind of what I've got to start. So, but anyway, super grateful to be part of this interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks. And last up is Katharine Gerbner.
All right, thank you. Well, some of what I'm going to say is going to reiterate some of Brenna and Jennifer's comments, because I thought the Barantini exhibition, the way that you described it, was just so evocative. I'm glad that you also showed us the video. I'm like, oh, can we have video in in a Word document? I just wish that that we could sort of, that could be more part of our sort of the way that we shared our work, because it was really important, even just seeing that I understood your descriptions in a richer way. I thought it was brilliant the way that you were connecting past and present. So yes, I'm a historian, but I think these sort of ethical calls to, I think you were quoting Vincent Brown as like what, having the past meet the needs of the present, and the thinking about this is why else are we doing what we're doing? So I thought that I had no problems with with that construction. Other things that I was stunned by, like Brenna, the speech by Victor Hugo. I mean, I think it was like kind of a jaw-dropping moment for me just reading the text. And as in, I think I have this experience multiple times that, I think I have this really clever theory about what people in the past were doing. And then I will read a historical text and I'll be like, oh, this isn't like tricky. Like, I don't have to read between the lines. I just literally need to read their lines. And just telling me, Africa has no history. And, and this is like the Europeans are giving freedom, right? So it's just stunning. Burials. So fascinating so like the Pantheon, when it's secularized, it's like then it is used as a burial place. I have a lot, you sort of you do some of the work there, connecting it with burial practices, the conch shells, their role in both insurrection but also burial practices in the Afro-Caribbean. I think you could do even more with that connection, because it's so crucial. It reminded me actually of Vincent Brown's first book, The Reaper's Garden. It's all about burial practices and how they were central to sort of the life in Jamaica. And yes, okay, so the questions that it raised for me, I've sort of already said the pantheonize, going even farther with this connection between the role of burials in the Black Atlantic and in the Pantheon. I just think there is a way in which burials just are this central ceremony that was a point of conflict between, let's say, missionaries and Black Christians, missionaries and non-Christian enslaved populations. It's such a touch point, I think, for negotiations about what is the sacred, and the demarcation of Black space in the Caribbean and elsewhere. So it felt like there's even more resonance that you could draw out of that. The big sort of thought I have in terms of a maybe suggestion has to do with, so you construct this as primarily there's two chronological moments, maybe three, right? And one is the moment where Barantini's exhibition and the performance, which is brilliant. The next one is sort of the creation of the paintings that were installed in the Pantheon. So we're looking at in Victor Hugo's speech, so late 19th century. And you mentioned that the Pantheon was constructed in the 18th century, but I was surprised that that wasn't actually the other moment. And so actually kind of drawing on what Jennifer was saying, I wonder if you would reconfigure, instead of talking about 1492, do the construction of the Pantheon as sort of this eschatological moment, because it's happening, I think this is me like Googling, right? But it sort of begins construction before the French Revolution, right? And then it's like, and then there's this transition. And of course, this is the same time as the Haitian Revolution, the first uprising. And so why not have that as sort of, because that is this sort of, for France and its empire, it just seems like a more poignant moment, a more poignant description of a battle that has real resonance right now. 1492, I had mixed feelings about, because that's, sure, it is Columbia's, but this isn't. The other things that are so important here in your piece are like that I kept having questions about is the nation, right? The nation state, I kept asking myself, what's the difference between the construction of the sacred in a Catholic absolutist empire versus the secular, nation state, different points in the 19th century, sort of things, Catholicism is a different role in France. So it felt like doing more with the 18th century, the second half of the 18th century, would speak to the specific site that you're discussing, and to the themes more effectively. And the final thing that I will ask about, which I think I'm the third person to sort of ask a version of this question, is where does Afro-Catholicism fit? I also was thinking, so the works I was thinking about in regard to this were Cecile Froment's work, and Aaron Rowe has working on Black saints. So like so the Afro Catholics, and here I think there's this tricky thing, and I have had to deal with this in my research also, right? Like my first book was looking at the role of religion, and then it's sort of the way it sort of worked itself into constructions of white supremacy. And so there's both a through line, a religious through line, a Christian through line, but there's also big differences, right? Like there are, Christianity is like Black saints, Christians, they're also used as this is part of the resistance as well as part of the construction of oppression. So figuring out what terminology to use, how to draw out those continuities that you do so well, while also marking out the changes. It's like the terminology, it's shape-shifting. And it can be very confusing to be like, I see something that's happening. I would use these words like it's like a residue, this Christian residue that's in white supremacy, or it's how to describe it. So I don't have an answer there for you, but I do think that it's something that you have to reckoning with Afro-Catholicism, its role in, insurrections, and also the through line of Euro-Christian supremacy, is something that I'd love to hear you talk more about. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. So now we have some time for our four main speakers to interact like regular humans do.
Wow. Thank you so much. I'm delighted that you all kind of resonated around similar themes, and that you're also your questions overlap to some extent, while also giving me, the materiality question, Jen, is so important. And the materiality in the Pantheon as well, with this kind of residue of Catholicism, that every body that is pantheonized needs a morsel of the body to enter in, but the only bodies that are missing are the Black bodies whose existence was, whose humanity was denied, and therefore their bodies could not be. The state could not recuperate the bodies they had annihilated. There's layers of materiality there that are really, along with the burial practices, those two, I think, when I talked to Raphael about just the power of, remembering, as Alexis Wells Ogogame puts it, of putting bodies back together in this ceremonial space through fabric and in conversation with stone, these also living, breathing kind of material forms. I think there's so much there to dive into. So I really appreciated those points of expansion. I don't want to take up too much time, but and I want to try to have a human conversation. But if I could, try to take one point from each of you, perhaps, just to address your points. So, how I see this project is different from the first, how I see banality working out here more, or in different ways. I think part of, the difference between research for a project that I did in the research was done in 2008 to 2010 for my first book, and then doing research today is that subtlety just does not feel like on the menu anymore. I just, like you were saying, Katharine, like you try to think of all these like subtle ways that people in the past were like working through these complex problems. Oh no, like it's all out there. So why are we dancing around it? And as fascism increasingly takes over Europe, no one's dancing around this. It's being said with an increasing boldness. And so I think that's part of where my kind of push to like that finality is not as relevant a factor in how this kind of power and privilege are being demanded and insisted upon in the present. It's through decidedly less subtle means than in even 15 years ago. So in thinking in these big civilizational kind of dualistic terms, I kind of want to acknowledge that that is part of this process, that there's, that Africa has no history is a claim that, Victor Hugo and Donald Trump can make in ways that are legible 150 years ago and today. So if at time it feels like a very I miss a more sophisticated tool, but I fear if we don't also use these sledgehammers as part of our toolkit, we're going to just keep letting these ongoing civilizational claims get made by these kind of fascist Christian fascist voices who are, increasingly taking up the public sphere. And so in some ways, it feels like a necessary response to the current moment is these less sophisticated, less hybrid, less fluid, less, precise tools. But then it does, of course, lead to a variety of problems. Like, Vincent Brown's work points to how in Jamaica, it's never simply Black resistance fighters against white evil colonists. There's, formerly enslaved Black people fighting with the British against, the enslaved people. There are deserters from the British Army fighting with formerly enslaved people, fighting with enslaved people. There are Christian residues in, Haitian practices and all of these. So the reason why we use such sophisticated tools is because, the dichotomy is not real and it's oversimplifies. So I'm really grateful for your suggestions about how to kind of try to find that, continue to keep that nuance present, while acknowledging that there is something far more brutal and less subtle going on here, that we need to kind of keep calling attention to. There's just no way to have the kind of racialized repercussions of the colonial period continue in the most profound ways that they are, without there being some way in which this dualistic battle is present and it is kind of woven into our economic and social and religious structures. So, so I thank you for kind of supporting that project to some extent, but also not letting me run away with it too quickly and too forcefully. The idea of kind of the 18th century is very exciting. And I think that's a really, both Jennifer and Katharine were kind of pointing to is the, end of the 18th century, actually France's 1492. It's purposeful decimation of Haiti and the 1802 reinstatement of slavery. It's a kind of eschatological event. And I think that is a really powerful way of framing it. I mean, when you go back and look at you think the French Revolution, right? You think the beginning of the myth of Europe as the space of liberty and equality and fraternity, that the myth of ever, growing progress and equality, that it's born at the same moment in which slavery is in fact reimposed and in which Haiti is decimated, and is such a. It means that we have to look back at so many things with a different viewpoint, and so recognizing that this French eschatological moment doesn't come out of nowhere, but it is related to that broader history of 1492. I really appreciate that kind of possibility of thinking it of these differences matter, right? That France was not a part of the Spanish Empire, right? It did not participate in that same early trajectory is important, and how it came into that to participate in that process is important, and the moments in which the French understand themselves to have become to participate in this cosmic battle, those matter too. So I think that's a really exciting way forward. Yeah, once you start looking at Europe through that lens, I go to exhibits all the time where I'm just like, oh, the Marshall Plan, huh? Right at the end of World War II and the beginning of the colonial wars, Europe decides, let's make sure white people feed each other first and make a bunch of deals for trade, trade partners that allow us to make sure that Europeans can kind of hoard these resources right at the moment the post-colonial struggles are creating a whole different set of possible partners of engagement. And so this seems like all this work of rethinking the past through a different framework. But that 1492 might be too big a framework to do that, and that instead there are more precise moments in French, in the French eschatological history that I could turn to. Okay, I think I'll stop right there for a moment.
Can I just, well, Jennifer, do you want to say? I'll just say something.
Well, I just was interested to hear some of the questions from the audience, but because
yeah.
If you would like, I could just roll some of those out right now, and then would that be helpful?
Sure.
Okay,
but Katharine, I didn't want to interrupt. I didn't mean to interrupt.
It's up to you, Elayne, what you want to do.
Do you want to jump in, Katharine, and as he's kind of sorting through the questions, you can jump in.
I had a quick comment, which was, I was just curious, sticking with I think that the benefit of like sticking with going to the 18th century also, I would love to know about the materials of the Pantheon, like the funding, right? Like where's the money coming from? Are there other lines that you can draw in terms of the construction of specific, like literal space in Paris? And the colonial empire, the Caribbean, I feel like in the 18th century, it's never very far away. So it's just another way to kind of draw out the arguments that you're making but doing so in a very, just sticking with that kind of the physical space of the Pantheon, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, that's I had a moment like that recently when I realized that to reconstruct the Notre Dame, they've decided to rebuild it precisely as it was before it burned down. So they need to rebuild the wooden structure that's hidden beneath the lead and recover it in lead. But to get wood to get oak that is large enough to construct such an edifice, they had to go to forests that were several hundred years old, and some of the main sources of the wood that's now in the Notre Dame were forests built for slave ships, built to create masts for slave ships, that just sometimes there are these just unexpected moments of recognition of just how it's there, beneath the stones. That's a really powerful suggestion. Thank you.
So I had a few DMs that I'm going to paraphrase, and then John Seitz has a nice question in the Q&A that I'll just read it verbatim. But one of them, this is from an undergrad who's in the audience. So this is more of a kind of like a biographical kind of question about how you ended up in the actual specific field that you're in, and how did you actually, like, how do you find a project like this? And, you know, how do you see this as being connected to, but also potentially like an evolutionary phase beyond the work that you've done previously? Another one is to do, person had a particular interest in your use of Sylvia Wynter, but generally a question about the process of essentially you have the subject matter that you're focusing on, and then you have like interpretive interlocutors that you're working with, and how do you find those people, and how do you find a match between someone like Sylvia Wynter or Saidiya Hartman for the work that you're currently doing? There was kind of this, maybe unpacking a little bit more the idea of eschatology, and how you see this, I forget how you actually phrased it, since I'm paraphrasing things, like the supernatural beings of the Pantheon. And then, oh yeah, there's another question about kind of another method question, which is similar to something that I've already paraphrased. So then I'll read John's question, or his response, which is really well put. So this is a quote. This is so important what Elayne is saying about an anthropological nuance and the grand claims that can combat others' fascist grand claims. John says, I'm stuck though, because I'm still hooked on the idea that nuance is the actual only long fascism.
A long-term Bible enemy of fascism. Yeah. Okay.
And people can, please feel free to keep messaging me. So.
Maybe I'll try to speak about the methodological questions about how do you find a project and how do you match a subject of study with the interpretive people you want to bring in. You know, it's I guess never as glamorous as you might think. As an anthropologist, I just kind of hang out at places and, you know, read up on what's happening and kind of follow my whims. And I can't deny that contemporary art practices have just constantly distracted me. I was like, enough of the contemporary art. You're not a contemporary art, you know, you're not an art historian. You've got enough going on. And I just like, but you know, week 2, I'm like, oh, look at that. And found out about Raphael's work and this thing at the Panthéon. And I knew I wanted to come to France this time to foreground its history of slavery. The kind of French myth of that France abolished slavery through its revolutionary practices, it tends to be emphasized far more than the fact that it enslaved. And I think something that reading people like Wynter and Hartman, you know, later than I should have in my career, they weren't part of my graduate studies. They weren't seen as foundational texts in anthropology in the way that I think now a lot of Black studies scholars and post-colonial scholars are more integrated into, you know, required reading. So they forced me to look at the things I already knew in a new way. And so the people that you come across and all of a sudden something you've been thinking about for 15 years appears in a completely different light. I mean, or something that you've always thought you understood appears in a completely different light. Those are the interlocutors you just hold on to and keep going back to help shape, you know, what's important to you and what you want to ask about the world. And those keep change, you know, keep reading. I try not to be, you know, just a Marxist or just hooked on one set of texts, and keep opening myself up to new things. But I certainly ride with thinkers for a while, and I see them as a kind of an ethical prod to kind of keep to not let myself get distracted by, you know, studying in Paris. There's a lot of beautiful big, heavy stone material things to get distracted by. And people like Winter and Hickman and others just sort of help keep my eyes on the larger questions that I think we really need to be addressing. And so, yeah, both cases for my research, they have been not well planned in advance, but I've lucked into wandering into the spaces that turned out to be really, exactly what I was looking for, or like spoke to things, like brought together a bunch of themes that I wanted to address. So that I think that's also part of the magic of the archives for historians, is stumbling upon something that you didn't know is there, and that all of a sudden opens a way for you. But it means you spend a lot of time reading things that are leading you in different directions and trying to like decide what's important and where to spend your time. We only have so many months in a sabbatical and so many hours in a day. So I'm sorry, I have no great insight into how to do that, apart from luck and following what excites you and interests you, and what your gut to some degree. So the kind of euhemized or the kind of divinized humans that the term I kind of take from Hickman, he sees this sort of 1492 as setting in motion a way in which humans begin to understand themselves not as gods, but as sort of acting on behalf of and in kind of moral kind of legitimation with their God. In particular, that Christians start using power in a kind of absolutist way, like the Christian God, which I think is a very evocative way to describe what happens on plantations in the Caribbean, the kind of power that's wielded there in these very absolutist terms. But that somehow the kind of the effective domination or conquest of different groups is also kind of mapped onto their gods, and opens up space for the refusal of allowing those gods in the public sphere, because they are the need to kind of vanquish humans and their gods kind of becomes a part of a process that goes together. And I mean, I do feel like it is, when you look around and recognize how Christianity has, for long before 1492, supplanted itself upon the grounds where other gods used to reside. It's part of a kind of a Christian practice that I think we need to pay more attention to, and that's not to say that it's ever perfectly effective, and that there's no residues that remain, and that there aren't new practices that form. But I really want to kind of make space for Christianity that is not working to annihilate other gods. Like that, why is it not possible for Christianity to coexist with other gods and spirits and ancestors? And even if those other spirits and ancestors show residues of Christianity and the colonial history in them, that doesn't mean that they aren't also something else other than Christian gods and spirits. And that I feel like that's a really important question for people who study religion to think about, is like, if we're interested in reparations on a material level, which we really should be, on a social level, economic level, why are we also interested in that in a kind of theological, religious level? So that the figures that Bertontini brought into the Pantheon are not just humans, are not just representations of humans long gone, but these possible like spirits and ancestors whose presence is, can displace, the paintings of Christ on the ceiling and push back against that insistence on only Christ. Yeah, when Fatima was breathing in front of me, I just had this, that thought of like, what if Cécile Katiman, who lived until over 100 years old, had come to the Pantheon. Why was that? There were Black people from the Caribbean coming to Paris at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, before slavery was reimposed. They were part of these early revolutionary moments. And what if also these kind of religious and spiritual practices had, actually made this a pantheon? I don't think we should assume that it was an impossibility at the time. I think we should maybe wonder if it was a possibility that was refused and with long-term effects. And as for John's point, I'm getting increasingly comfortable with my big sledgehammer. And that's, kind of scary for me too. But I think as somebody who's studied privileged groups as an ethnographer, I've really been thinking about what it means to do that. And one of the things I ended up doing in my first book was to not try to humanize the groups with which I was working in the same way that I would do in other ethnographic contexts. I didn't kind of flesh out the people I was describing, in part because they didn't give me as much access to their personal lives, so I didn't learn nearly as much about them as other anthropologists and other kinds of social and political contexts might. But also because there is so much already to amplify their humanity. So I needed to step back a little bit and note the way they're part of these broader structures and how they articulate these broader structures of power, rather than, of course, the ways they also question those at times. That's not to say I didn't note those moments, but I felt like when you're thinking about power and privilege, sometimes you have to kind of step back from the human and make space for that structure of privilege and how the particular people are able to embody that again and again and again. But that I could never do this sort of work if it wasn't for all of that other work that goes on to, I think both are vital. And I just think that more style scholars of religion could take on the sledgehammer, could take on this less nuanced work too. We shouldn't feel afraid to make big, bold ethical claims about the past and the present. The stakes are, ever increasing. And so I want us to find a way to do both.
Well, if Katharine or Jen, do you have anything that you want to chime in on at this point?
I'm sort of just mulling over the kind of the language, the metaphorical language of sledgehammer and nuance. I mean, I guess I'm wary of that distinction, right? Because I think sledgehammers work better when there's, like nuance is the content, or maybe I'm thinking more complexity, right? So sledgehammer kind of implies a blunt instrument, and yet I think in the work we've just read, there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of nuance, and so, and I think so if we're talking by sledgehammer, we mean sort of really radical and stark critique. I think that's, that's more effective when we have these complex understandings of the past and of how history worked. I guess I just don't see those in stark relief in the same way, and maybe that's the historian in me kind of, that all we have from the past is sort of the specificity of human experience, the particularity of human experience, and that's where, the starkness of structure and human suffering are uncovered or understood, right? And so, I was struggling a bit with with that language, right? Because it doesn't feel to really capture the work that I've read. Yeah.
Which, I mean, what you're saying also kind of reminds me of like some organizing, right? Where like on one end, people are making big, bold claims in like the public sector, that in some ways like could be interpreted as being like maybe like too like not unnuanced, but then they're also reading someone like Saidiya Hartman as well, right? It's like informing the way that they're making those claims.
I mean, I do feel like, Elayne, like, okay, so the Academy is under attack. Its relevance, like rightfully perhaps, like and we sort of, it seems like fewer and fewer scholars are willing to make bolder, like, I don't even like the language, but bolder claims or starker. I like starker better, maybe, claims. And, I like when I mentor graduate students, I'm like, well, where's the gravitas in the work here? Like there has to be on some level, like life and death, because of the world we live in, but the world that we've always lived in, right? I don't think the circumstances have changed. I think but it seems like for several decades, at least a couple decades, scholars in many fields have been more focused on, more comfortable making smaller scale interventions, and I do think that we need, that like our work needs to matter, right? And our interventions should have some relevance, but for the reasons you've described, and we shouldn't, I think we've been timid. When you make bold claims, it's considered less scholarly, less nuanced, but bold claims matter because they're grounded in particularity and nuance and specificity of experience, right? Because even in the starkest of circumstances, human experiences are highly contextualized, highly specific, and also that's where connection opens up too, like our capacity to receive the critique, right, is because we our own unique specific because we see our humanity in the specificity of human experience, but I agree with you, like I think we need scholars, not all scholars, but at least some people to be making larger interventions and claims, yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your point that sometimes we can't just be making claims that are not grounded in the specificity of human experience, of course. That's, we need to hold on to our empiricism, our various forms of empiricism, in order to effectively counter. But yeah, I mean, I think as an anthropologist of Christianity, I've been kind of part of a movement to kind of the anthropology of Christianity for a long time, was very much interested in showing how Christians in any given context were always engaging in ways they understood to be moral and righteous, and to kind of find the ethical underpinning of actions that might actually otherwise seem kind of reprehensible.
Huh.
And I think that there's risks with that, I'm sure Victor Hugo understood himself in some way to be articulating, and he understood, he had a moral framework, that informed that speech. But on the day to celebrate the end of slavery, right, that he goes there is so it strikes me as like a kind of a doubling down in a way that refused complexity, refused nuance, and refused, you know, and insisted upon European morality, Christian morality.
But that's a historically specific moment
It is.
that requires a nuanced context to understand the violence of that, right? Like, so,
yeah,
right?
true.
Like, and, you know, and I want to say, like, I'm endlessly frustrated with my, you know, so I'm in the history department now, and I, you know, the sort of the reluctance to move from the context and and, you know, I guess the complexity, I feel more comfortable with than nuance. Like, nuance implies, especially the way you're using a sort of erasure, you know,
Right.
but complexity and specificity to larger critique and interrogation and claim. So yeah.
But it is, I think I increasingly find myself comfortable using terms like that Hickman and Winter bring to the table, like cosmic battle, you know, it is, and then kind of making the leap from Victor Hugo's speech to the cosmic battle, right? That's just, I think that's what I mean by the kind of, I feel it's like an analytical sledgehammer in some ways, right? Like rather than kind of keeping the analysis too close to the ground, feeling the willingness to make that leap, to call it out, especially when it's, I mean, he's a little bit too ridiculous an example because it couldn't be more explicit than that. But even in cases where it's, you know, like the paintings in the Pantheon, where I think it's kind of less clear exactly what they are.
I'm just, you know, I find myself wrestling with this idea, the tension that John identified between, right, like so-called nuance, whatever we want to call it, and, you know, the what you call the sledgehammer. I agreed with Jennifer. I actually think it's what you're doing isn't actually the sledgehammer. It's not exactly the right metaphor. But I guess like, we only have a few minutes, but I'm sitting here thinking like, well, what is this discussion really about? You know, is it about making so-called, you know, bold claims? Like, what does that actually mean, right? And is that about sort of having a specific like political position? Is it about making a specific claim for reparations? Is it making a specific or like a claim that's related to the content that you're talking about? So, you know, just as to throw out this question, so like when you were talking about what if Fatiman had come to the Pantheon, what Bartolini is doing is bringing her to the Pantheon, right? Like, so it's a reimagination. It is the creation of sort of a different space. And so number one, you know, I want to sort of re-emphasize the point I was making before about like what I think is really powerful about academic work and academic labor is our ability to say, oh, look, you know, I'm writing this new story about the Pantheon. Here are these moments in time, linking them together in a narrative that sort of blows our mind, right? Like that forces us to be like, oh yeah, I think it could have been different in the late 18th century. And maybe if you can find like evidence about the physical construction also, and linking that to these histories of enslavement and colonialism, that would be even more powerful. But then, you know, what can you go into the like an argument for the future, and a reparative argument? Like where does that take you? And is that where you want to push, right? Like, what is the vision?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, I think that's another part of the puzzle to figure out is these like, yeah, I would love to see some of these paintings in the Pantheon removed and a whole bunch of space made for other kinds of paintings. But I also, you know that I can only make arguments about what reparations look like in conversation with activists who are doing that work in community on the ground. So that's another kind of layer of that, you know, the stakes are also not, sledgehammer is not a right metaphor for that either, because analytical stakes and are tied to what have to be quite specific community-based kind of claims about what repairing this problem would look like, what, ending the cosmic battle might involve. And I think that's something that's really very hard for us as academics to do on our own, partly because we're very unaccustomed to making normative claims, and because we have too long kind of separated the study and struggle practices. So I think that's a really important question, and also one that I can't really begin to answer in any responsible way on my own, I think.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to, I don't know if you've seen, but Vince Brown has a new article in The Guardian that came out.
Yes.
Okay, because I was going to be like, it really, I feel like, encapsulates a lot of the potential, but also the difficulties in this.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, definitely the research I'm doing with groups in Martinique, they're like, Catholic Church, whatever, like.
I've been thinking here, and we're at the bottom of the hour, I guess, but that Haiti was for, like, the word reparations and its multiple valences, Haiti was forced to pay reparations to the French, right? And that was the language for the lost property, including enslaved people, right? And then how the language about reparations, like how removing saints from the Panthéon helps with it makes any sort of qualitative difference to Haiti that continues to struggle and has made demands, right? And I think it's Citibank, right? Like Citibank is the one that received those reparations, and that has, Haiti's holds some of that debt for Haiti, and so it comes back to, like, okay, how does that repair actually, or that any sort of recovery of that ruination, right? Beyond some sort of imagining otherwise about the past, but confronting the reality of Haiti today, right? And
I do think that, like, there's an interesting couple of collections about reparations out there that point to its multi-strands, right? Material being primary. But I feel like religious reparations are an interesting question. That it's not, I'm not the first at all. And lots of Black Christians have, made these arguments. So, but thank you both, and all three of the interlocutors so much, and for everyone participating in such great questions. I'm really honored to have had this opportunity today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting us to be here. It's a great piece.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate everyone coming. Really curious to see how this, how this manifests actually in terms of, like, its public rollout, especially because of the audio-visual part. I think that's really interesting. And obviously people have been writing about the arts for a very long time, but it's always, when I see and hear things, it's always interesting for me to imagine, like, how it's going to end up turning into whatever it turns into. So that'll be exciting to see. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Great to see everyone. Yeah.
All right. Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.